trailblazing approach to race as an international and a comparative question, to me really galvanized my interest in his work and his friendship. Before I introduce our panelists for this session, I just wanted to give a couple brief words of thanks. First of all, of course, to International House and to the Race Center. But I also want to give a quick word of thanks to the Center for International Social Science Research, or CISR, which I was the former director. And I particularly want to give a thanks to the current director, my successor, Jenny Trinitapoli, and the associate director, Emmanuel Viedma, because this was something, this idea for this symposium was sort of an idea that Tiana and I hatched up, in a really, obviously a very, very difficult moment for Tiana in particular. And the idea of doing this symposium is something that meant a great deal to me, and it's something that CISR didn't have to follow through on after I was no longer at the University of Chicago as of July 1st. So the fact that they've carried through on that promise and that we've been able to bring this project to fruition means a great deal to me. And so I want to thank CISR for sticking with the idea and staying behind it. And also want to thank Tiana and the other organizers for continuing to include me in the event. It means a lot to me to be able to be here and play a part, however small, in helping bring this about. So, without further ado, let's start with the introductions. We have three panelists today. We have Juliet Hooker from Brown University, Danielle Clealand from Florida International University, and Yanilda Gonzalez here from the University of Chicago. And may I just start by saying, hello, women also know stuff. So, brief introductions. Juliet Hooker is professor of political science at Brown. She's a political theorist specializing in racial justice, multiculturalism, Latin American political thought, Black political thought, and Afro-descendant and indigenous politics in Latin America. She's the author of Race and the Politics of Solidarity and Theorizing Race in the Americas, Douglas, Sarmiento, Du Bois, and Vasconcelos, excuse me on that. I should have read that in advance. Danielle Clealand received her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in political science, and she joined the faculty at Florida International University in 2012. Her research examines comparative racial politics, group consciousness, Black public opinion, and racial inequality with a focus on the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and the United States. Dr. Clealand's book, The Power of Race in Cuba, Racial Ideology and Black Consciousness During the Revolution, examines racial ideology and the institutional mechanisms that support racial inequality in Cuba. And last but not least, Yanilda Maria Gonzalez is assistant professor in the School of Social Service Administration, or SSA, here at the University of Chicago. Her research explores the consequences of violence and inequality for state capacity, democratic citizenship, and the relationship between citizens and state institutions in the Latin American context. Her book manuscript, Authoritarian Coercion by Democratic Means, The Paradox of Police Reform in Latin America, probes the persistence of violent, corrupt, and unaccountable police institutions and the political and social drivers of institutional continuity and change. So without further ado, I believe we have Juliet Hooker on this screen, and if you could give us about 15 minutes, Juliet.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lynn, for that introduction, and thanks to all the organizers for putting together this event. I'm very sorry that I can't be there with you in person. As you may have heard, my flights got canceled because of the storm that hit Providence, and I want to thank also Marcus for his work and accompanying me through the various cancellations yesterday. So our charge today was to give an account of how we engage with Marx's work, and or how he has shaped our thinking about comparative and transnational approaches to the study of race. And before I get into that question, I want to say something about Mark as a friend, a dear friend, and also somebody who was a model to me of the kind of scholar who opened doors for others, both as a mentor and as a friend. And I think this was, something that was central to his practice as an academic, but also is true of his intellectual legacy in terms of opening up areas that I think are now becoming really important as we think about the study of race comparatively and transnationally. And for me, a great example of that, which I was just thinking about as I was writing my remarks for today's panel, was a panel that he organized at the 2010 American Political Science Association on Latino political thought. And it was the first organized, sort of featured panel on Latino political thought at the APSA. And I was lucky to be invited by Mark to be a part of that panel, along with Cristina Beltran and Arlene Davila, Linda Alcoff, Ines Valdez, and I think I'm forgetting someone else that I can't remember at this moment. And one striking thing about the panel, in addition to the fact that it was, on Latino political thought, is the fact, of course, in this era when political science is belatedly paying attention to the question of manels, or, panels that are all male, that it was actually an all-female panel, with the exception of Mark. And I bring this up because I think that panel, in some ways exemplifies the ways in which Mark's interest in race was not simply focused on Latin America, right, but led him to think about race as it happened in other places, and think about it in particular in relation to Latinos in the United States. And this, of course, was very important given his institutional location at UCLA and the kinds of students that he was training. And I think, even though, right, this was to me, this is indicative of the way in which he was generous intellectually. Is that this wasn't necessarily Latino political thought, a field that he was working in specifically, but one that he was interested in and using his position to open space for others to give greater visibility to people who were working in that area. So for me, then, one of the ways in which I relate most specifically to Mark's work, I think he's known perhaps better for his work on Cuba, but I think he was deeply committed to thinking about race comparatively and transnationally, and that is both reflected in the work that he did analyzing racial formation in the US and Latin America. And also in particular, I think about the edited volume with Eddie Tellez on African Americans, on relations between African Americans and Latinos in the United States. And again, I think this comes back to this question of how it is that, to one key thing that stands out for me about his work, which is not just having a comparative approach to thinking about race, but in particular this commitment to trying to think about, the way in which Latinos are racialized and the ways in which you need to think about Latinidad in terms of race. And this is related to, I think, and salient for me because of the recent work that I've been doing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. My most recent book, which is an account of racial thought in the Americas, the US and Latin America in the late 19th and early 20th century, puts US African American and Latin American thinkers in conversation. And one of the things that it argues is that we can look at these two traditions, which are often seen as disparate, right? And these thinkers that are seen as having put forward very different accounts of race, and in fact, they have a shared intellectual context, and they're responding to what they see as the way in which race is functioning in the other America in order to intervene in debates about race and debates about racial policy in their own countries, right? So in the chapters on Sarmiento, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, the Argentine intellectual, I focus on the fact that he comes to the United States right after Lincoln's assassination and lives in the US for, 3 years in the 1860s during the height of Reconstruction, and how that shapes the way in which he thinks both about, education, looking at the efforts to educate the freedmen in the South, and also to think about the possibilities of what he calls Argentine Reconstruction. And similarly, during this period, for example, I look at the work Frederick Douglass, who at various points in his career, we tend to think about Douglass as the sort of quintessential example of an assimilationist African-American thinker, that Douglass at key moments in his life looks beyond the US and in fact to Central America and the Caribbean for models of Black self-government and of multiracial democracy that can inspire African Americans and also serve at different moments as models, right, for what the U.S. can become. And so there's this fascinating moment in the 1870s when he endorses the annexation of Santo Domingo, which is now the Dominican Republic, which he sees as a Black republic, in a move that would no doubt scandalize contemporary Dominicans. And he endorses annexation, right, because he thinks this is a way of bringing what he calls a Black sister to Massachusetts into being, right? So creating this fostering Latin American immigration and non-white immigration in general is a way of decentering whiteness in the United States. And so Douglass embraces this idea in the 1870s of a human right to the idea of a human right to migration that he argues can serve as a model for how the U.S. can become a true multiracial democracy. And so for me, right, what's interesting about these moments is the way in which these thinkers read the other America selectively. They romanticize, right, these in the case of Douglass, the extent to which there really is, in some cases, a degree of a lack of racism in some of these Latin American spaces. But those narratives help them to intervene in the local context in which they find themselves. And so the book is really trying to say that when we think about race in the Americas, we need to think about it as part of this hemisphere-wide conversation that's ongoing and that is long-standing. And so that, in a way, this very construct, right, of the very idea of the distinct and different approaches to race that have emerged in the U.S. and Latin America is constructed in specifically by these thinkers who are using comparison, hemispheric comparison, to advance different local agendas. And so when I think about this project of the book, I think about it in as related to Mark's work, because I think it reflects his his interest in thinking comparatively and transnationally about how both racial ideas and racial ideologies, as well as anti-racist political mobilization, emerge in the Americas. But I also think it reflects this interest, which I think is an important also trend in the field of thinking about, race and Latinidad in the U.S. So the final chapter in the book is a chapter on the Mexican intellectual Jose Vasconcelos, and ends with a section where I look at how Vasconcelos is taken up late by U.S. Chicano nationalists in the 60s and 70s, and even later by queer feminist theorists like Morian Saldúa. What I try to think about at the end of that chapter is thinking about how drawing selectively on these Latin American sources becomes a way for these U.S. Latino thinkers to position themselves vis-a-vis debates about race in the United States. And that portions of that, or the thinking in that chapter began, actually, I presented the very initial, ideas about that on that panel, Latino Political Thought at APSA in 2010, that Mark organized, and that would later go on to become an article in Politics, Groups, and Identities on Latino racial exceptionalism. But so I guess what I want to say is that I think there's an important conversation that has happened, I think, about how to think about race comparatively and transnationally, that has happened in relation to the, to the work that Mark produced, but also in relation to the spaces that he opened up for other people to have those conversations because he was committed to having them. And I think that, the students that he trained and the, the work of people who benefited from those spaces, I think thinking about questions of how ideas travel, how racial thought has emerged in the hemisphere, and thinking about, what are the ways in which, anti-racist political mobilization has happened historically and is happening today. These are questions that, that are receiving growing attention and that continue to be, particularly the last question about, right, what is, this question of how is it, racial progress, racial backlash, and then how do you have, anti-racist mobilization is of course a critical one at this juncture in both the US and in Latin America, where we're seeing this right turn that has these kind of authoritarian, patriarchal, and racist overtones that are very similar to what is happening in the United States right now. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, and thank you.
Hello? Okay, so I prepared, as many of us have, some remarks about how I met Mark, and then I'll talk a bit about my work. So as an MA student, I was getting a master's in Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU, and I knew that I wanted to study Cuba. And even though my interests, my life, my family history had all been profoundly defined by race, I never thought about it being something that I could study as a profession. At the intersection of political science and Latin American studies, my two concentrations, the study of race did not figure prominently, or sometimes at all in the case of Latin American studies, in the curriculum or the scholarship that I was exposed to. When I arrived at Chapel Hill as a new PhD student, and my cohort began to talk about what they were most interested in, I had an epiphany. I decided that I wanted to study Black politics in Cuba, but then as I looked around at my new department, I realized there would be no one to guide me on this journey. And so I began to look outside of the department. I decided I would make connections that way, and soon discovered that few in the discipline were interrogating race and politics in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's how I came to track down Mark Sawyer, who did answer my email, and really feel affirmed in my choice to become a comparative racial scholar. As I began to think about the kinds of questions I wanted to ask, I realized that Mark was asking similar questions, and soon understood we were kindred spirits in scholarship. Indeed, when I sat down with him a year later to have lunch, and said that I planned on writing my dissertation on Black consciousness in Cuba, his response was, "But I've already done that." I was not discouraged by this response. I just smiled at the candidness of it, which I would do many more times after that, and started to think about how I would add to what he had done in new ways. I later learned Mark would always be rooting for me, as he rooted for other Black scholars, and that was one of his gifts to the discipline. He knew that studying a marginalized field as a Black woman would be challenging. He knew that political science needed our voices. Once my manuscript was written, and at dinner after the workshop, he said to me, "Well, now I'm going to have to write a new book so that I can stay relevant." Again, I smiled at his candidness. I was proud to have his approval, and I wish that I could have read his next project. It's important to talk about Mark's work as it relates to the transnational study of race, particularly in the Americas, But I want to also acknowledge the ways in which he worked to have comparative racial politics included in more mainstream discussions, not only in the larger field of political science, but even in the field of racial politics, which in our discipline has often neglected to travel beyond the borders of the US. This means that now in classes about Black politics or race and ethnicity politics, there are comparative discussions about how race, racism, and inequality look outside of our own borders. Comparative racial politics is a subfield within a subfield, but Mark's work was an important step in creating a more comprehensive field of racial politics. And I mean that not only about his work, because obviously he wasn't the first person to write on racial politics in Latin America, but he also pushed for that, right, to be included, in his own conversations, with his colleagues. This is obviously an ongoing process where transnational perspectives in the study of race are still being argued for and introduced. One important example is Juliet Hooker's recent work. I remember sitting with him once at dinner, and he commented that it is still a struggle to be published in more mainstream journals that are most respected in political science. Nonetheless, Mark was one of the strong voices in the inclusion of a comparative lens, not only to answer some of the questions that he tackled in Cuba and the Caribbean, but to decenter the United States and use comparative cases to help us develop a more holistic theory of race and racialization. Today, as we observe the ways in which institutional racism is denied here in the US in order to maintain racial inequality, it is clear that racial ideologies are elite transnational projects that call for a global reading. Latin American countries have employed many of the tricks that we see leaders both on the left and the right employ here for at least a century. Arguments that deny the institutional nature of racism, conflate racelessness with racial progress, charge discussions of racism as divisive threats to national unity, are all common tropes of Latin American racial ideology that have existed since independence or the abolition of slavery. Mark highlighted the ways in which the state hid racism and racial inequality in Cuba, but also how we might compare Cuba to the United States. And I think, his work, not only in Cuba, but in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean is so important, also because this is work that just has not been done, right? And so, Mark was opening up these doors to talk about racial politics in places where we really still don't have, right, a lot of work on this. So I want to talk about my book. There it is. And obviously, Mark figured prominently in the writing of my book, he gave me advice along the way, and a lot of people gave me bad advice about, distinguishing your, concentrate on distinguishing your work from Mark's, right? Or criticize Mark and then you'll really make a splash, advice that Mark would never give, right? And a wise woman actually told me to forget about all that, and I really was able to enjoy writing the book, right? Because essentially, this project is, a continuation, right, of a lot of the questions, that Mark asked. So my book was motivated by the question of how racial ideologies influence Black identity, Black public opinion, and Black activism. And so that led me to write a book that explained how the state in Cuba and many other states in Latin America have managed to create an ideology that we all know well exists, denies the existence of institutional racism. But I was interested in how it does it so successfully amidst a racially stratified society, right? How does racial democracy work? And I think a lot of the work that, for instance, Michael Hanchard did talked about the consequences of racial democracy. Mark talked about, when and how states utilize, right, these ideologies, and I really wanted to talk about how it works, right? Why do people believe in it, and then how does it then affect people's notions of race and racism? And so what I did was talk about in three components, and many of these components we've talked about or we've heard already today. So the three components that I talk about are silence, this notion of anti-racialism, and the framing of racism as individual prejudice. And this is obviously not unique to Cuba, but Cuba does it very well. Partly because it's an authoritarian state and they can silence like no other, but also because, you know, socialism makes racial democracy even more believable, right? Because it claims to be the mechanism through which Cuba, you know, brought racial justice, right, or racial equality, you know, to the nation. And so, you know, this is a story about, you know, the Americas, but specifically how Cuba kind of has mastered, right, these components to make people believe in racial democracy. And the silence, you know, still exists. I think in other places we see, you know, that the silence has been broken to a great extent through social movements. But still in Cuba, and also, you know, in Puerto Rico, which is what I'm working on now, you still have that silence, right? The black voice was eradicated at the start of the revolution. Black organizations were outlawed. There was a vibrant black press that was taken away. And so voices were, you know, literally silenced. The silence was legislated, you know, in a very deliberate way. So that the state could then say, you know, we've solved this problem, you're welcome. And so the silence is also in the census, right? Cuba is, you know, actively collecting data, racial data, but not sharing it. No one can get their hands on it, right? And so, you know, obviously it matters to them because, right, they collect this data. So race is salient, right? But they're not sharing that data. And so all of that is part of this silence about, you know, how racism works. The other component is this notion of anti-racialism. You know, in Cuba, you know, I find this very powerful because basically, you know, along with the idea that racism had been solved, there was also a message being conveyed that if you are a revolutionary, you cannot be racist. And that eliminated a lot of white guilt, right, about racism. And what I find is that in that way, right, if none of us are racist, right, then nothing can be racist. And so the survival of anti-black language, right, anti-black humor, is all there alive and well, you know, amidst this silence. And nobody really thinks twice about it because, you know, it's not something that they have to worry about, right? So for instance, I had an interview, you know, with a woman and I asked her, you know, about racism and she said, oh, no, you know, I have wonderful friends, you know, of color and I work with wonderful people of color, you know, and I'm not racist. And I said, okay, well, what about if your daughter married a black man, right? And she like, you know, puts her hand on her chest and she goes, no, she said, you know, and, you know, I'm not talking about, you know, back in the day. She said, you know, I'm talking about today. You know, I couldn't handle that. You know, I always teach my daughter that girls are the most precious and have to be protected, right? And so, but I could never tell that woman that she was racist, right? She was a revolutionary. Her best friend was, you know, a woman of color. And, you know, there was no racism there, right? Another interview that I did, you know, this woman said, no, I've got lots of black friends, you know, I did try to date, you know, a black man, you know, he smelled very nice and he dressed very well and he had none of the typical, you know, characteristics that black people do, but I just couldn't do it, I was just disgusted, right? And she's telling me this very freely. You know, there were so many moments in Cuba where I had to check my color and then, you know, continue the interview because I couldn't believe, right, that I was hearing these things. And so, you know, that kind of, you know, culture, you know, that promotes this black inferiority is part of this, right? Because there's silence, but there's also much discussion, right? Race is everywhere. You know, I walk down the street and everybody's shouting at me, right? Mulata, mulata. You know, I'm raced constantly. And so, you know, what happens is that, you know, everybody's talking about race, but nobody is actually taking a part, right? what racism is, how it works, what it means to be racist, even on an individual level. And families aren't talking about it, right? And so that's the other thing, you know, that I found. Oh my gosh. Okay. So if we can go to the if you can go to the next slide, and then the next one. So part of this is, you know, this idea that, you know, social relations are very fluid, right? In friendships, right? This does not exist in intimate relationships, right? There are certain rules among white families, and all of the white families that I interviewed had these rules, that their children were not to marry anybody that was not white. But this idea that social relations, right, have nothing to do with race is something that people think about because of this idea of anti-racialism, right? If you go to the next slide. At the same time, there's this awareness of, right, many do not consider blacks to be as efficient as whites. And this is a survey, I should say, I was trying to rush because I got a call for 5 minutes, but what I did in Cuba essentially is do a survey of only black Cubans. And so my interviews were with whites, mixed race, and black Cubans, but the survey was only of black Cubans. And so, you know, the book takes on a mixed methods approach very much, right, in the tradition of Marx scholarship. And so, you know, there was this awareness that white people are distrustful of black people, right, or they have these negative attitudes about black people, but not thinking about that as far as, you know, how does racism work, right? Does this matter in my relationships? You know, which I found very interesting. We can go to the next one. Okay, back one. Oh, forward one, sorry. And then the last component that I talk about is this framing of racism as individual prejudice, right? And this is something that we find throughout the region. You know, Tiana talked about it. And I find it to be a particularly powerful frame. I find it to be a particularly powerful frame here in the United States as well. You know, even as we're talking about systemic issues of police brutality, you know, a lot of people think about this as these individual cops, right, who are racist, but not about this systemic problem. And so in Cuba, right, you can find, right, speeches from 1959 up until today, right, that frame racism as this notion of individual prejudice. And most of my interviewees, regardless of how they felt about the government, regardless of how they felt about the revolution, did not see racism as systemic. And they would describe systemic issues to me. They would describe employment discrimination. They would describe racial profiling. They would describe, you know, lack of representation in the government, but they would never connect that with institutional racism, right? This was always something of individuals, which takes the onus off the government, right? It takes the onus off of, you know, the government and policy, and it also creates this kind of apathy, right, around activism. When we think about activism, you know, if we have an idea in our heads that racism is only among individuals, and this is something that can only be fixed with time or with education, or with progressiveness, right, or with a revolutionary attitude, then, you know, we're not thinking about organizing. And then, if you can, where's this one? If you can go to the next slide. I'm going to skip this, but the idea is that structural racism is there, right? If you can go to the next one. Keep going, keep going. One more time. One more time. So I asked in the survey about experiences with discrimination. And I left it open-ended so that people could then describe what those experiences were. So that I could get, you know, a larger sample, but also, right, more detailed responses. And what I found was that, you know, a good portion of the people that had experienced discrimination, or blacks that had experienced discrimination in Cuba, were experiencing, right, structural racism, right? Or the effects of structural racism. If you just go to the next one. Right, and so between employment discrimination, systemic racism in general, right, and racial profiling by the police, you find that, you know, people are experiencing the effects of structural racism, but they're not perceiving it in that way, right? And I think that that is very much related to the way in which racism is framed in Cuba. It's very much related to, right, these tools, you know, of racial ideology that affect public opinion and that affect people's, you know, notions of their position, right, in society and how racism works. So to end, you can just hit along. The second part of my book looks at Black consciousness, right, and so in a way, this, you know, takes the point where Mark left off, right, because after, you know, Mark wrote his book, there was a lot of activism that began, right, particularly in Havana, that I was able to study. And so you have these circles of academics, artists, particularly the hip hop movement as well, that are now, you know, being heard, right, by members of the government. There's not any policy, right, action, but they are being heard by members of the government. Some of it is being co-opted by the state, right, but there are activist circles. And so I wanted to talk about that, but I also wanted to talk about these ordinary citizens who do not have a space to talk about race, right, do not have a space to talk about racism. And so all of these conversations that are happening in their homes, you know, in the workplace, in the families, because of the experiences of racism, right, particularly, you know, racial profiling by the police, these are these kinds of informal networks of Black solidarity that are being created in Cuba, right? This is what Black politics looks like when Black politics is not allowed to enter into the public sphere. And so I call that the kind of informal underground, you know, forms of critique, where they are critiquing racial democracy, they're challenging and confronting racial democracy, but it's within these private settings. And most interestingly, when I asked about organizing, if you can go to the next slide, 60% of the sample, right, of, you know, 410 Black Cubans thought that Blacks should organize, right? So something is there, right, brewing under the surface, that, you know, has the potential to become, you know, a Black movement, a larger, you know, conversation about Blackness and about racism. And so that, you know, is what, you know, has been most exciting for me, to really look at, you know, the potential of a more vibrant Black politics in Cuba, should that space be granted. You know, my work, if you can go to the next slide. So to end, my work now is focusing on Puerto Rico. You know, coincidentally, you know, the last time that I saw Mark was when I invited him to be on a panel at NCOBS last year at this time, and I presented my new work on Cuba, and he told me that, you know, after the panel, he told me that he's working on discrimination in Puerto Rico. I meant Puerto Rico. That he's working on discrimination in Puerto Rico. And so once again, right, you know, our minds were connected, right, in this way. And, you know, and we talked about, you know, how that, you know, work is so exciting, right, because essentially the silence exists in Puerto Rico as well. And so this is our logo for the survey that we took on with the University of Puerto Rico. To survey Puerto Ricans about experiences of racism and Black consciousness as well, about voting behavior. A lot of questions that I wasn't able to ask in Cuba, I was able to ask in Puerto Rico. And so looking at, you know, how we can compare these two, and taking, you know, that piece, right, the 2004 piece on Cuban exceptionalism, you know, that Mark was involved in, which is really still being used, right, because there's so much, and talking about, you know, what that looks like on the ground, right? So that if, you know, Black folks are, you know, patriotic and they have high levels of national attachment, but they do recognize racial hierarchies, then how do they, you know, perceive racism? How do they perceive their own identity? Do they have a politicized racial identity? And so these are the kinds of questions that I'm asking right now in Puerto Rico. And so, you know, I really feel like my work is, you know, continuing, you know, what Mark did, right, and what he was interested in, and I'm proud to do that, and so, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I just want to just express how grateful I am to be in this space with all of you, and just express my thanks for being invited to sort of share my work in this context and to talk about the influence of Mark Sawyer in my own work. Even though, unlike I guess maybe just about everybody else who has spoken so far, I didn't know Mark Sawyer. I didn't know Mark Sawyer perfectly. Personally or perfectly. I didn't know Mark Sawyer personally, and so, but I've really appreciated the opportunity to speak with so many of you and to hear your memories of Mark Sawyer, and I feel like I've gotten to know this person who I only knew through his books and his articles, and so I've my main contact with Mark Sawyer has been through his work, or my only contact has been through his work, which I got an opportunity to really dive into as a graduate student, at Princeton, where I did my graduate work, but I would say in political science more broadly, there really wasn't a lot, or rather in comparative politics, in the Latin American context, there really wasn't a lot of work that was taking into account race and racial mobilization and how those shapes political processes specifically. I think that in the American context, there's a lot of work that has come out recently that looks at questions of race and how it shapes, for instance, criminal justice system, which is my area of interest in Latin America. And so I felt, particularly beginning in graduate school, that there weren't a lot of folks working in Latin America in political science that sort of could really speak to this question of how race and policing intersected. So I sort of had to piece together, you know, different folks. Like I worked a lot with Eddie Tellez in sociology, and Tanya Hernandez, a law professor who was visiting. And so these were the folks that were thinking about race in Latin America at the time that I was a graduate student, in ways, and thinking about how they shape political processes that were of particular interest to me. And so when I came across Mark Sawyer's book and Mark Sawyer's broader work, it was, you know, it just opened up a lot of doors, I think, a lot of conceptual, theoretical doors for thinking about these questions that, with respect to policing the state and citizenship in Latin America that I had been interested in pursuing when I was a grad student. And as I was preparing for this symposium and this panel and this presentation, I think I hadn't even been aware of how much of Mark's work and how many of the key concepts that he developed and brought into comparative politics of Latin America and the issue and thinking about race. I didn't realize how much of that it had influenced my work until I was preparing for this. So I'm also very thankful that I had the opportunity to undertake that reflection. I think we don't often get to do so in political science. And so I wanted to just go over a few of those key concepts and how I view them in studying sort of what are some of my main research questions around political and social choices around policing in Latin America. And so his sort of work on racial hierarchy and racial status, and how those operate in contexts, in context of, you know, sort of Latin American exceptionalism and mestizaje or racial democracy, which are supposed to have been antidotes to racial hierarchies. And so his analysis of those concepts of racial hierarchies and racial status were really key for me to thinking about sort of the distribution of policing and how that, and disparities and how that affects communities in Latin America. But one of the other really interesting things that I really appreciated about Mark's work is sort of the contradictions that emerge within sort of these racial hierarchies and racial status, where particularly folks that are disadvantaged by those racial hierarchies and racial and stratified social status along race, is that those who are more disadvantaged often buy more into political projects that disadvantage them. Right, so his piece on, I'm thinking specifically of a piece on patriotism across the Caribbean, and thinking about how Black identified people ended up identifying with stronger sort of patriots and sort of national pride than those of than those that were white and who were benefited by those racial hierarchies. And so for me, as a Dominican, that was really a revelatory piece, but it really shaped again how I think about policing, as I'll discuss further on. And then I think that the third component of Mark's work that I think, again, I think I didn't realize how much this influenced my own work and sort of my own engaged scholarship today, is this idea of crossing borders, of transnational. You can compare countries that people didn't think you could compare, right? So my work is on Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia, and people often ask me sort of, how could you compare these? And I think that I, was fortunate to come across scholars like Mark Sawyer early on in my graduate career, where that wasn't even a question that I had. Of course you can compare. Of course you can compare these countries. And so again, in thinking about in my own work today, where I'm sort of shifting into a new project, thinking about how do we compare police violence and responses to police violence across Black communities in São Paulo, Brazil, and Cali, Colombia, and in Chicago, just all around us. And so so I'm just going to sort of go over some key components of my research that I think were really influenced by reading Mark Sawyer's work as a graduate student, and it was really a treat to be able to go back to some of that in preparation for this. So can you do the next slide? Thank you. So my main research questions concern, as I said, sort of political decision making about police reform and the persistence of police violence and corruption. And I think that the U.S. Research on these questions are far more advanced in thinking about how race is a part of these processes, particularly more so the criminal justice system more broadly rather than policing itself. But I think that for me, it was really important to incorporate the work of scholars like Mark Sawyer and to think about how racial hierarchies and racial status are both inputs and outputs of policing. And specifically, I think about what I call the sort of distribution of protection and repression, which is most of what I'll talk about today. And what I mean by inputs and outputs is that, of course, this is not news to anybody, but it's also not something that is much developed in the comparative politics literature in Latin America, but it's just that thinking about how the intersections of race, class, gender, and geography, all of these things are a filter through which policing is delivered. It is what determines whether you get police protection or whether you are vulnerable to police repression. And that's been the sort of I think the key thing about my work, that even though I'm looking at these sort of higher level, macro level political decisions being made by governors or presidents or, in some instances mayors, about what policing is going to look like, whether we're going to undertake reform, whether we're going to maintain the status quo, is that these micro level dynamics happening in low-income communities, that in places like Brazil are largely composed of Afro-Brazilians, that those micro-level dynamics very much scale up to the macro level decision-making about whether or not to undertake reform. And so I wanted to talk about, I guess I'll just sort of mention the sort of broader context in which I'm thinking of this. My work is really driven by the understanding that policing is integral to citizenship. That not only is security itself a human right, but that without basic security, you cannot possibly undertake the social, economic, political activities that are constitutive of democratic citizenship more broadly. And so when we think about how policing shapes those, shapes the ability to really engage in the practice of citizenship, it becomes, you know, pretty evident as soon as you land in places like Chicago or Sao Paulo or Cali, Colombia, is that access to your relationship to policing is very much going to be determined by those factors. And it results in what I write about in a piece that came out last year, is that the provision of security, or policing rather, is both contributing to the construction of constrained citizenship as well as stratified citizenship. Constrained citizenship refers to the what we call under-policing in the U.S. context, is sort of the under-provision of protection in these communities, which leads to those constraints in terms of your ability to engage in those activities of citizenship that I mentioned. But that access to that protection is also stratified because it's not that everybody is equally constrained in accessing that citizenship, accessing that protection, but that actually it's shaped by characteristics of race, class, gender, and geography. And so this is kind of, I think I wasn't able to fully explain those concepts, but I think you get the sort of basic idea that for me, thinking about policing and citizenship and political decision-making about policing is really inextricably linked to thinking about how the intersection of race and class and gender play out, and geography play out on the ground. And so I wanted to give a couple of examples from my field work in Brazil primarily. Oh my gosh, how did that happen? I have only 5 minutes. I wanted to just give a few examples from my field work in Brazil to think about this question of the distribution of protection and repression, and how race in particular acts as a determinant of whether you get one or the other, and how that's delivered. And I should note, of course, I think that Tiana highlighted this in her presentation, but perhaps even more so than other places, but it's true everywhere, right? But that race is, that you have to think about race and class together, and you have to think about geography. And so I'm going to put the next slide up. Thank you. And in Sao Paulo in particular, but we could show many maps that show similar concentrations, right? That this is the Black population in Sao Paulo, but if we were looking at poverty, if we were looking at violence, if we were looking at police killings, it would look very similar in terms of the distributions of the colors. And so I wanted to I wanted to share a couple of my of ethnographic sort of details from my fieldwork in Sao Paulo to think about this question of how race, class, and geography intervene in this process of the distribution of first protection and repression. So I wanted to first highlight an instance that I observed in Sao Paulo that thinks about this question. So first, I was in a community in, I won't say which, because I cite people saying pretty terrible things, and so I don't say which communities I work in. But I was working in a majority Black and low-income community in a low-income region, and I was with a community leader. And he complained to me and to the local police commander that police cars were placed along a major road rather than within the community or its commercial areas. The police commander responded that the governor had requested this distribution of cars because he had received complaints from residents of a neighboring wealthy municipality, and you should also read that as majority white, that they had suffered robberies when they were driving through this community. And so in this case, the governor made a decision in which the actual police that was supposed to be offering, in theory, protection to the majority Black, majority low-income community in the city's periphery, that those police officers, those resources would actually be allocated for the protection of the largely white middle and upper class Brazilians that were merely traversing through that lower income community to get to their own higher income community that bordered this community. I mean, I think we could also layer politics partisan politics into that, and so that largely white, higher income municipality neighboring the low-income community where I was working also voted for the governor's party by 60%. In the previous election, while the low-income residents of the largely black, largely low-income residents of the in the community where I was working was actually a stronghold of the Workers' Party. And so you see that something as crucial as policing and the provision of security intersects in clear ways with race, class, geography, and of course politics. And so it's those types of sort of the relationship between those micro-level dynamics and macro-level political decision-making about policing that I'm particularly interested in. I had a few other anecdotes that I wanted to share, but I guess I'm speaking slower than when I first wrote this and read through it. So I wanted to just think about disparities in the question of police repression. And so, of course, much like the U.S., policing in Brazil is police repression in Brazil is very much disproportionately targeted toward low-income and Afro-Brazilian communities, typically located in the urban peripheries, much like you can see here in the case of São Paulo. And so, in one instance, I was speaking with somebody who worked in the police ombudsman office. Who worked in the police ombudsman office, which is the entity that doesn't exercise any kind of oversight or anything that we want to see civilian entities exercising over the police, but they do receive citizen complaints, and that is their primary. They receive citizen complaints and they publicize them. And in speaking with the official from the ombudsman office, he said to me, most complaints come from the 3 Ps, which is a term in Brazil that's used, and particularly São Paulo, is used to refer to an intersection of vulnerability for vulnerability to a lot of violence and structural and otherwise. And so the 3 Ps refer to being preto, pobre, da periferia. So that means that you're black, poor, and from the periphery. And so what this official was saying to me was that most of their complaints about police violence came from the 3 Ps. And he added, we don't receive a lot of complaints from Jardins, which is a mostly white, wealthy area of São Paulo. And this is kind of a dynamic that is played out in lots of different ways when it comes to policing in São Paulo, to the point where, in the 1990s, 57% of victims of police killings in São Paulo were black, whereas they were only 25% of the population at the time. More recent studies have found similar proportions, noting that black Brazilians, black paulistas, are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white paulistas. Similarly, more broadly across Brazil, researchers have also found that 76% of victims of police killings are black, whereas Afro-Brazilians are just about more than half, or just over half of the population. So at every level of sort of police activity, we see that this racial disparities exist. And one of the things that I always wondered about in my research is whether is how aware or how much race is part of the discourse when it comes to police violence. And when I got to Brazil and started doing this research, and particularly in 2012, race was often not directly talked about in the way that it is here. And particularly NGO people would say to me, we need you to ask them these questions about race because you're a foreigner. We can't really engage them in this conversation. But I found that sort of as I spent more time with police officers, many of whom, if not most of whom, were black themselves, you sort of started to see how policing was indeed shaped by race. Oh, sorry, could you skip to the next? Forgot that and so I just wanted to tell an anecdote from an interview with a police officer where he said to me, I actually started to talk to him about stop and frisk in New York and the racial disparities that emerged there, and I was like, but that surely doesn't happen here. And he said to me, you know what, if there was a black guy and a white guy and a black guy, stop the black guy. Next slide, please. And in fact, this wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark that a police officer made to me, but it was very often official policy. And so what you see here is a document that was issued by a police battalion in the city of Campinas, where they specifically instruct police officers when conducting stops in a wealthy white area known as Taquaral of Campinas, that they should stop individuals, particularly between the ages of 18 and 25, who are black or brown, sort of black and mixed race, or preto or pardo. And so you stop the black guy, vaya abordar el negro was very much an official policy at different moments. I wanted to mention this, just very briefly, this idea about, well, I guess I have a minute, 3 minutes ago. And so I guess I wanted to just end with this question, just very briefly. Next slide. Next slide. Well, okay, sorry. There was a slide missing. But anyway, about this question of contradictions. And again, how those who are most affected and most disadvantaged by racial hierarchies often end up buying into political projects that construct these hierarchies and disadvantage them. And I think that this is actually a question to think about for future research, and to think about sort of going forward in Brazil. Because what we're seeing, I mean, I think a lot of folks who write about Brazil think about this paradox wherein people from the urban peripheries who are black and low income end up supporting police violence. And so one of the things that I wanted to note is that if in the map that you just saw, that those sort of darker areas also saw very high votes for a right-wing candidate who's being compared to Trump and who's likely going to be a presidential candidate. And so I think that it's thinking about these contradictions that I think Mark Sawyer's work highlights so clearly, I think is going to be something to watch out for in the case of Brazil. And then just my last 30 seconds, I wanted to end with this idea of crossing borders and how we can incorporate that into thinking about the role of race and policing. And so what we have here is a banner from the Mothers of May in Brazil, which is a group of mothers that who lost children to police violence in one particularly brutal massacre in Sao Paulo. And it's being held by the daughters of Ronald Johnson, who was a young black man who was killed by police right here in Chicago. And so just to say that immediately when they saw this banner, they knew exactly what it was and they wanted to be the ones that held it. I was going to hold it at this protest, but they were like, can we please hold this? And so people on the ground who are experiencing this, they see the connections, they see that, they cross these borders, they don't, need us to do it, and so we need to catch up with them and really think transnationally about these relationships as well. So I'll stop there, and my thanks to for the patience. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all three of the presenters for, fantastic presentations, very much in the spirit of the event, to say the least. And apologies for my repressive tactics in trying to police or otherwise restrict the voices going on here. So as moderator, I was just asked to make a couple of remarks. I'm going to be very, very brief so we can have at least collect a few questions before lunch. But I thought, just as one sort of observation, I wanted to kind of offer a metaphor that struck me over the last two sessions. And I know that I was hoping to find a metaphor that Mark would appreciate. And I know he was a lover of jazz. So it seems to me a musical metaphor might be one way to think about our conversations and how they move forward. So it seems to me that a lot of we kind of think about dividing the conversations we've been having into, there's singing in a major key and then there's singing in a minor key. And predominantly I'd say there's a lot of singing in a minor key going on right now. These are very, very dark times in many ways, and we're hearing about authoritarian neoliberalism, and we're hearing about backlash, and that's going to obviously be a very big part of the conversation if we want to tackle these topics transnationally, comparatively going forward. And I think just one thing I was really struck by was Tiana's remark that we need to think more about whiteness, and that we need to think, particularly in Latin America, we need to think more about the ideologies, racial ideologies of dominant groups. And not only of the racial ideologies of subaltern groups that are mobilized to overcome these inequalities. I think we've got to put masculinity on the table right alongside whiteness as well, right? So these are things that obviously have to be a big part of the conversation. But I'd also say that there's also, at times, you hear hints here of singing in a major key, and hints of optimism, and the idea that there's still important struggling going on. And I was struck by Juliet's phrase when she talked about the idea of this hemispheric search for models of multiracial democracy. You know, the idea that I think a lot of people, I remember, a decade or so ago, people get really interested in studying Brazil. They think, well, there's this, maybe there's a different model out there, and this sort of thing. And this seems kind of maybe a little bit outdated or naive or not the right key to be singing in at the moment when there's so much to be pessimistic about. But I guess I would just say that when we think about models of multiracial democracy, we have to think beyond the nation state. And we have to be thinking, no matter how bad things look at the national level in so many of the places that we care about, we have to be thinking about the ways that those models can emerge in small spaces, in spaces like this one. We think about the example of Black Lives Matter, examples of these community kinds of movements, and see the ways that democracy can emerge, and multiracial versions of democracy can emerge in ways that don't involve the nation state. And just on a personal note, so in terms of building institutions, what lured me from Chicago to Michigan to a large extent was to be able to run a center called the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. And that's usually met with a lot of gallows humor these days. Oh, you're going to run a center on emerging democracies nowadays. That sounds like something there's not much to talk about. But a big corrective I want to bring to the center, and I hope it would be in the spirit Mark would appreciate, is that democracy emerges in all kinds of spaces, in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of scales, and in all kinds of levels. And even when the people with the most power in a country are not cooperating and are turning things in an authoritarian direction, we should always be working ourselves toward and be attentive as scholars to the ways that democracy can emerge in other kinds of spaces. We don't have to have a Brazil. We don't have to have these kind of massive models, positive models in mind for us to think about how we can build things in a more just, more inclusive direction. So just want to make those remarks. We are close to out of time, but what I would like to do, I think for maximal benefit for our panelists, would be if we could collect a handful of questions, and then by virtue of lunch, I'm sorry, Juliet won't be able to be here for lunch for this part of the experience, but then if you have other questions or other conversations, we can proceed with those during the lunchtime. So could we maybe collect a few questions from the audience on these outstanding presentations? No?
Thank you for all these presentations. They were really interesting. I had a question that's perhaps also one of these graduate student questions. And when I think about comparative analysis, I'm usually thinking about commonalities and differences. So I guess that I wanted to ask you, when you went into the field and throughout your analysis, were you mostly struck by the commonalities you found with the other models you had in mind? Or was it mostly the differences that struck you? Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I have a question, I think, close to her question, and I think it's because I'm Brazilian, and I want to do a comparative study myself, and I came here to US, and I stuck with this idea of how hard it is, because I had many criticism about American scholars doing work field in Brazil, and sometimes comparing different realities and thinking that a group is less conscious or less mobilized. And I came here with this idea of the paradise of consciousness and awaken people, and I'm finding a different thing. So what I want to understand is how we intellectually engage on a comparative study, but not exactly to do a hierarchy between who is more awake or who is more, or who achieve more, because governments change and we can have a good government for Black people and 4 years after nothing. So I just want to build this discussion about how to compare and respecting the Black intellectuals that are sometimes that died, and we don't have as much access. People that don't got, the opportunity to publish and are not known internationally, but we're really important, and in the ground level.
Thank you. I do have two more.
Thank you so much for an excellent panel. So those of us who study anti-Blackness, racism, racial hierarchy in Latin America often get questions, rogue questions that always come from the audience about like the number of categories that people classify in, and how do you know who's Black? And of course, I always give the Black movement responses, ask a police officer. But I think, I actually do think with all this rich ethnographic stuff that's going on now, that there are some re-emerging questions that can come from a more sincere place around how we want to characterize the racial orders of Latin America. And, in all of your comments, there were different ways in which like the kind of idea of just a color line of a like white non-white or black non-black color line seemed the most meaningful way to kind of characterize the racial order. And then there were other times with like, people calling you mulata and thinking about who was in your study and who wasn't in your study that made me think about these middle categories in different ways. And so I just wanted to put on the table, and because Mark also, you see some of those tensions and nuances in his work where he talks about pigmentocracies in some cases and talks about color lines, right, in other cases. And so I just wanted to put on the table a question around like how we might think about the racial order now, and if it's legitimate at all to like think through some of the differences between the lived experiences of darker skinned Latin Americans and people who aren't as dark.
Thank you for those wonderful papers. I was really impressed with Danielle and Maria's work, and it speaks to me in a lot of ways. Actually, I want to invite you both to give talks at our Latin American Studies program at UCR. I got to bring you eventually. The most interesting thing, though, is with all the talk about capitalism, neoliberalism, etc. What's interesting about Cuba is the socialist case study, right? And we think about like a very neoliberal city like Sao Paulo, and then we think about Cuba, and we see the sort of the stubborn nature of race within any type of political economic system. But what I wanted to ask Danielle is, I was just in Cuba in October, and I just noticed like huge gentrification in La Habana Vieja. I mean, there is like a creeping neoliberal sort of spaces in Cuba. So did you see like an agitation of racism or racial consciousness because of these changing sort of political economies in Cuba? And then for Maria, the stuff around the contradictions is amazing. How I just sort of, it's more of a comment than a question and an encouragement as well. With the refugees that I've been interviewing, people coming from Central America, a lot of young people who are fleeing gangs, women fleeing gang violence, etc. They support death squads and mano dura policies against the gang members. And I'm like, but those are exactly the policies that created the gang members in the first place. So I'm just wondering, are you going to explore those contradictions further? I want to hear more about more of your thoughts on those contradictions. Because I think it's precisely where those contradictions are at, where we need to be doing the academic and the political, cultural work.
Well, thanks again to the presenters for the excellent questions. Hopefully we can all be discussing over lunch, and I believe we should be ready to adjourn. So join me in thanking all participants again.
Should we answer some of them now?
I take 5 minutes and then
Completely up to
Can I just answer because I need to go actually answer the person who asked the question who was Brazilian?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I want to say that I think those are really important questions that you raise. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is precisely this idea that we need to approach the task of putting different regions and thinkers and texts in conversation without, while avoiding this kind of ranking impulse that's inherent to comparison. So I use the idea of juxtaposition to try to think about methodologically how we might put different texts, different regions, different places in conversation without the end result being this sort of claim of who's doing better on race, right? And in part, the other way that I try to, sort of think about that question is to say, this is also the question itself, the claim itself is one we